Today, the world feels mapped, safe, and known. Every mountain has a name, every city glows at night, and we walk over the ground without thinking about what lies beneath it. But sometimes the earth remembers what we've tried to forget. In a quiet field somewhere in Europe, a construction crew dug into the soil and found bones. At first it looked like a burial site, maybe ancient, maybe peaceful. But the deeper they dug, the stranger it became. The skeletons were twisted, crushed, thrown together without care. Men, women, children, all tangled in one pit. It wasn't a cemetery, it was a crime scene. And when scientists dated it, they realized they were looking at something the world had never seen before. The oldest evidence of genocide ever found. Thousands of years before kings, before writing, before nations, people had already learned to destroy entire communities. This was not war. It was deliberate, systematic extermination carried out by people just like us, farmers, neighbors, humans. What makes this discovery terrifying isn't just how ancient it is, but how familiar it feels. It shows that the line between creation and destruction, between cooperation and cruelty, was already drawn when we built our first villages. The pit didn't just reveal bones. It revealed a truth buried deep in human history, that the first great invention of civilization wasn't peace, but us versus them. If you're listening to this at night, maybe let that sink in. Somewhere beneath the ground you stand on, the earth remembers every choice we've ever made. Subscribe maybe, and tell me where you are and what time it is for you. I read those, and it's wild. London in the morning, Manila after midnight, all of us connected, all of us descended from the same people who once buried their fears in a pit of bones. You know that feeling when the ground under you doesn't feel like just dirt anymore, when you realize it's holding secrets older than everything you know. That's what happened one afternoon when a construction crew somewhere in Central Europe broke through a patch of soil that should have been nothing but clay. Their machines struck bone. Not one or two. Hundreds. Tangled together like a knot of ghosts, trying to climb out of the earth. At first, people thought it was a forgotten cemetery, maybe victims of a plague or a war from the Middle Ages. But the scientists who came to investigate quickly realized this was something far stranger, far older, and far darker. The bones didn't lie in neat rows. There were no coffins, no burial goods, no sign of ritual or respect. The skeletons were twisted and overlapping, some face down, others with arms locked around one another as if they had fallen together. The soil was packed with broken skulls, shattered ribs, and stone points still lodged where they struck. It wasn't a burial ground, it was a pit of violence, a crime scene sealed for thousands of years. Archaeologists began cataloguing every fragment. They found men and women, the very old and the very young, all mixed together. Many showed clear signs of fatal blows. A hole smashed through the back of the head, a jaw broken by force, ribs crushed inward by impact. It was methodical. Not random, not an accident. The kind of killing that takes time and intention. Imagine it, a quiet farming community, living thousands of years before pyramids or written words, suddenly wiped out. Every generation before us learned to plant and harvest. These were some of the first people to call land their own. And here, in this pit, was proof that someone else decided to erase them completely. The ground held no traces of fire or disease, no collapsed houses or flood deposits, just bones. Whoever did this didn't come to conquer. They came to destroy, to remove a people, not just defeat them. For decades, scientists have debated when humanity's worst instincts began, when the first war started, when someone decided an entire group didn't deserve to exist. This pit might be that moment written in bone. It's not famous like a battlefield. There are no monuments, no written names. But what lies here could be the oldest evidence of genocide on Earth. And the strangest part is how quiet it is now. Grass grows over the site. Birds nest in the trees above it. To anyone passing by, it looks like peaceful countryside. Yet under their feet lies a frozen story of fear, hate, and survival. A record of how early humans learned to destroy their neighbors completely. These bones are not just ancient remains, they are testimony, and they are asking a question that echoes across 9,000 years. When did we start killing not for food or territory, but for identity? When did we first draw a line between us and them? The pit is still waiting for an answer. The first thing they noticed was the smell of wet earth. It filled the air as the archaeologists lowered themselves into the pit, boots sinking into the dark soil. What had looked from above like a scatter of bones quickly turned into something else entirely. It was chaos frozen in time. Skulls tilted at strange angles, ribs tangled with femurs, tiny hand bones pressed between the limbs of adults. The deeper they dug, the more the pattern repeated. Not careful placement, not ritual, but dumping. The dead had been thrown in, layer by layer, as if they were nothing more than debris. The team moved slowly, using brushes and wooden tools to clear the dirt. Each sweep revealed more horror. A cracked skull with a circular hole at the back, a femur snapped in half, the break still sharp. An arm bent the wrong way. One skeleton was that of a child, no older than 5, curled in on itself as if it had tried to hide. The bones of another were stretched out, arms over the head, a position that looked like defense. These weren't people who had died in peace. They had been struck down. What unsettled the researchers most was how mixed the bodies were. There was no separation by age or sex, no sign that anyone had been buried by those who cared for them. It looked like an entire community thrown into one grave without ceremony. Some still had stone arrowheads embedded in the bone. Others bore deep gashes along the skulls and spines, blows meant to kill quickly. The evidence didn't whisper of a disease or natural disaster. It shouted of violence. In that silent pit, the archaeologists could almost hear the echoes of it. The cries, the chaos, the final moments of panic. But science doesn't move on emotion. They measured, photographed, documented everything. Each bone was tagged and mapped so its position could later tell a story. Over time, a grim picture formed. These people had been attacked suddenly. There were no signs of defense structures or barricades nearby. No arrows found pointing outward. The victims had not fought back as an army would. They had been taken by surprise, overwhelmed, and executed. As the sun dipped low, the shadows in the pit lengthened until the skeletons seemed to sink back into the ground from which they came. The team climbed out, silent, dust clinging to their gloves and faces. One of them said softly that it looked less like a grave and more like a garbage pit for human lives. Another wondered out loud who could have done it and why. They didn't know it yet, but those questions would lead them on a journey that would change how we understand violence itself. This wasn't just an archaeological site. It was evidence that the urge to destroy entire groups of people might be as old as civilization itself, and they had just begun to uncover its story. In a bright white lab miles away from the excavation site, the bones were laid out on long metal tables. Each skeleton was carefully separated and numbered, the way detectives label evidence from a crime scene. The scientists who worked here were not archaeologists, but forensic anthropologists, people who read bones the way others read books. Every fracture, every nick, every missing piece carried a clue about how a person had died. The work was quiet. Only the sound of pencils scratching notes and camera shutters clicking broke the silence. Under the fluorescent lights, ancient bones took on the cold gleam of ivory. One by one, the specialists examined them. They looked for signs that separated injuries that happened long after death from those that happened at the moment of dying. When a bone breaks after burial, the edges are dry and splintered. But breaks that occur in life, or just before death, show smooth, fresh edges. In this pit, almost every skeleton showed perimortem fractures, breaks that happened right before the moment of death. That meant these people hadn't been buried by accident. They had been attacked. The scientists noticed patterns. Many skulls had the same kind of wound, a single heavy blow to the back of the head. Others had small round holes made by arrows or spear points that pierced through bone and stayed lodged there for thousands of years. Some victims had broken arms, raised in front of their faces as if trying to block a strike. It was clear these people had tried to protect themselves. But what made the experts stop and stare was how systematic it all looked. The wounds weren't random. They followed the same rhythm, the same precision. It was organized killing, not a chaotic fight. Someone had rounded up these people and executed them one after another. The bones told a story that words could never capture. In one set of remains, a mother and child were found close together. The child's skull was small and fragile, fractured in the same way as the adult's. The mother's arm bones were outstretched, suggesting she might have been shielding the child when the final blow came. Another adult's leg showed a healed fracture from long before the massacre, proof that they had once survived something hard, only to die here. The lab, filled with evidence of violence, layered over lives once ordinary. The more the scientists studied, the more the pattern looked like something chillingly human. The attackers knew what they were doing. They struck with precision meant to end life quickly. They spared no one. When the analysis was complete, the lead researcher wrote a single line that would later echo around the world. This was not the aftermath of battle. It was deliberate extermination. The bones had spoken, not with words but with scars, telling the story of the first genocide the world ever forgot. When the scientists finished cataloguing the remains, they realized they weren't just looking at victims, they were looking at the vanished population of an entire village. The numbers lined up too perfectly to be coincidence. There were young men who might have been hunters, older women whose bones showed signs of long years of labor, and small children still growing when they died. Every age group was represented. It looked like a complete community, frozen at the moment of destruction. But then something strange appeared in the data. Certain people were missing. There were far fewer young adult women than expected. In a normal settlement, they should have made up a large portion of the population. But here, their absence was like a gap in the pattern. That missing piece told its own story. The women hadn't died in the pit. They had been taken. The rest had been left to rot in a mass grave. That realization changed everything. This wasn't just a random attack or a raid gone wrong. It was targeted. The killers had separated their victims by age and sex, killing the ones they didn't need and taking those they did. It was a method as old as fear itself, the same twisted logic seen again and again across human history. The archaeologists went back to the site to look for more clues. They found the remains of burned huts, smashed pottery, and scattered tools. The entire village had been wiped clean, as if someone had deliberately erased every sign it ever existed. The few artifacts that survived, broken grinding stones, pieces of decorated pottery, fragments of weaving, suggested these people had lived simple, peaceful lives. They grew crops, raised animals, made tools, and built small homes clustered around shared spaces. Nothing about their lives hinted at warfare or weapons. Yet something or someone had marked them for destruction. The landscape around the site showed no signs of a natural disaster. No flood sediments, no volcanic ash, no disease-related mass burial layers. Whatever had happened here, it was human in origin. The demographic pattern made that painfully clear. If it had been a natural event, the dead would have been random. But the fact that the attackers had chosen who to kill and who to take revealed intent. It was the liquidation of a community, a cold decision carried out with precision. The scientists could almost feel the echoes of that day. Maybe it began with the sound of shouting in the early morning, the rush of footsteps, the first strikes. Panic spread through the small houses. By nightfall, the survivors who had been spared were marched away while their home burned behind them. The pit became the final chapter of their story. Thousands of years later, the bones still carried that silence, the silence of people erased not by time, but by other people. What was left behind wasn't just death. It was the memory of a world deliberately destroyed. When the demographic charts were first drawn, the pattern didn't make sense. The pit contained dozens of men, plenty of children, and even the elderly. But where were the young women? At first, the scientists thought it was random chance or maybe a problem with preservation. But the numbers held steady even after new samples were studied. Women between the ages of 15 and 30 were almost completely missing. It was as if an entire generation of daughters and mothers had vanished. In ancient populations, that kind of imbalance doesn't happen naturally. Disease strikes everyone. Starvation doesn't choose by age. But here, the absences were surgical, intentional. Someone had decided which lives ended in the pit and which ones continued elsewhere. That realization sent a chill through the research team. They weren't just looking at a massacre anymore. They were looking at a plan. When archaeologists studied similar sites from the same period, they noticed the same thing. Mass graves filled with men and children, but the young women gone. In every case, it pointed to abduction. The survivors weren't survivors at all. They were captives. The more scientists compared data, the more the pattern looked deliberate. It wasn't about victory or revenge. It was about domination, wiping out a rival group and absorbing its women into another. It sounds unthinkable, but in the deep past, it may have been a strategy for survival. When resources were scarce, taking over another group's women meant taking their future. Every child born after that would carry the blood of the victors, not the defeated. The dead in the pit represented more than a single tragedy. They represented the end of a lineage. To understand how brutal that is, imagine the scene. The attack comes quickly, maybe at dawn. The men rush to defend their families, but they're outnumbered. The children are caught in the chaos, the elders unable to flee. The attackers kill anyone who resists. Then, when the screams fade, they search the ruins and take what they came for. Food, tools, and the surviving women. Those women are forced to walk away from everything they've ever known. The pit becomes a symbol of what was left behind. When the archaeologists realized this, the site changed from tragedy to testimony. It spoke of organized violence and social systems capable of unthinkable cruelty. It showed that, even in the earliest days of settled life, humans had already learned how to erase an enemy's identity, not just through death, but through capture and assimilation. That's what makes this discovery so haunting. The killers weren't monsters. They were people who farmed, traded, and preyed like their victims. And yet they carried out an act so deliberate it echoes through time as one of the first human attempts to destroy not just lives, but memory itself. The missing women are proof that this was never random violence. It was a strategy, a way to end a people completely while ensuring their bloodline lived on in someone else's hands. The question that haunted the scientists was simple. When did this happen? The bones looked ancient, but ancient could mean many things. A few hundred years, a few thousand, even tens of thousands. To find out, they turned to one of the most powerful tools in archaeology, radiocarbon dating. Tiny samples of bone were taken from the pit, cleaned carefully, and sent to a lab where scientists could measure the faint traces of carbon still locked inside. Every living thing absorbs carbon while it is alive, and when it dies, that carbon begins to decay at a steady rate. By measuring how much is left, researchers can tell how long it has been since death. When the results came back, the room went silent. The massacre didn't belong to the Iron Age or the Bronze Age. It was far older. The numbers pointed to roughly 7,000 years before the present, during the early Neolithic period. That means this pit of bones was older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than the first written words carved into clay. This happened long before kings, empires, or organized armies. The killers and the killed were farmers, living in the dawn of settled life when humans were still learning what it meant to live together in permanent communities. The idea that such horror could exist that early shocked the researchers. For a long time, people had believed that large-scale violence came later, after societies became complex, when leaders had soldiers and soldiers had weapons. But the radiocarbon dates told a different story. The desire to destroy another group was not born with civilization. It came first. The pit revealed that even at the very start of human cooperation, there was already division. These were people who had just learned to plant crops and build homes, and somehow they had also learned to plan massacres. The dating also revealed something else. The climate at that time was changing. Around that same period, parts of Europe were becoming more crowded as farming spread. Resources grew scarce. People who once roamed freely were now tied to land they considered their own. Competition for soil, water, and game could turn neighbors into enemies. When life became fragile, fear grew, and fear has always been the seed of violence. Holding those results in their hands, the scientists realized they were staring at a truth older than history itself. Civilization didn't create violence. It simply gave it structure. The people in that pit lived in a world without cities or borders, yet they carried out something that looked chillingly like organized war. The bones, the dates, the evidence, all whispered the same thing. Long before humanity built monuments or wrote laws, we already knew how to turn on each other. Violence is not the shadow of progress. It is one of its foundations. When the team began sorting through the soil taken from the pit, they found more than bones. Scattered among the remains were stone tools, the kind used for farming and daily life, but some of them were different. Flint arrowheads, long and finely made, still carried traces of impact where they had struck bone. Blades carved from the same kind of stone were sharp enough to cut through hide and flesh even after 7,000 years underground. These weren't weapons of an invading army or strange outsiders. They were the same tools the victims had used themselves, the same shape, the same craftsmanship, the same fingerprints of a shared culture. That discovery was devastating. It meant the killers were not strangers, they were neighbors, maybe even relatives. Archaeologists compared the style of pottery fragments found near the site. The attackers and the victims belonged to the same Neolithic culture that had spread across the region. Their pots had the same curved rims, their tools the same flint sources. Even their burial customs, before this massacre, were identical. This was not a story of foreign conquest. It was a story of a community turning on itself. That realization added a new layer of horror. The people who planned this killing probably spoke the same language as those they slaughtered. They worshipped the same gods. They built the same houses. The only difference was whatever line they had drawn in their minds that said these people were not us. That invisible line is the oldest weapon humanity ever made. The physical weapons were primitive but efficient. Flint blades fixed to wooden shafts. Adzes, heavy stone tools meant for cutting wood, repurposed for crushing skulls. Spears hardened in fire. Every mark on the bones matched these objects perfectly. The blows were powerful and deliberate, showing strength and control. Whoever did this knew exactly how to kill quickly. In a way, it was the first war fought with farming tools, the same instruments used to grow life, now used to end it. The archaeologists imagined the moment of attack. Dawn breaking over small huts, smoke rising from cooking fires, then shouts and the sound of feet, arrows slicing the air, blades flashing, the weapons that once built their homes now tearing them apart. The attackers didn't just destroy a settlement. They sent a message. They knew what they were doing. Each artifact dug from the earth became part of the story. A cracked arrowhead that still carried traces of bone, a stone axe stained dark from contact with human blood long turned to dust. The tools told a truth more haunting than any legend. Violence didn't come from outsiders. It came from within. The first war wasn't between tribes that had never met. It was between people who once shared bread and built fires together. And that makes it even harder to look away. There was a moment during the research when the scientists realized the usual words were not enough. Calling this massacre a battle didn't fit. Calling it murder didn't fit either. What they were seeing in the pit was something larger, colder, and more deliberate. Every detail pointed to a single purpose: to remove an entire community from existence. But could something that happened 7,000 years ago really be called genocide? That word didn't even exist until the 20th century, when it was invented to describe the organized destruction of entire groups during modern wars. Yet the definition fits disturbingly well. Genocide is the targeted killing of a distinct group, the intentional destruction of its people, culture, and future. The bones in that pit match every part of that pattern. The victims weren't chosen randomly. They were part of one settlement, one extended family, one identity. The attackers didn't just kill the warriors. They killed the children, the elders, and everyone in between. They spared only those who could be used, the young women who would be absorbed into the attackers' group. That is the erasure of a lineage. Even the way the bodies were dumped into the earth shows systematic execution. No care, no burial rites, just disposal. The scientists began comparing this event to modern examples, not to sensationalize it, but to understand its nature. The same logic appeared in every case across history, from ancient massacres to the worst tragedies of the modern world. Once people start thinking in terms of us and them, anything becomes possible. The Neolithic attackers didn't need borders or armies or propaganda. They only needed belief. Belief that those people in the next valley were different enough to deserve extinction. That thought alone is terrifying because it shows how little it takes for ordinary humans to cross the line into horror. Archaeologists found no signs of defense walls or fortified structures in the village. It was not a stronghold or a military target. It was a home. Families lived there, raised animals, planted crops, made pottery. These were the very first farmers. And yet, someone saw them as a threat that had to be removed completely. The site forces us to rethink when human cruelty began. Violence didn't evolve with complex societies. It grew alongside them, like a shadow. It tells us that even before we had nations, we already had the idea of group identity strong enough to kill for. That realization shakes the foundation of what we think civilization means. Because if this pit truly represents the earliest genocide, then it means humanity learned to destroy entire groups before we ever learned to write their names. The bones are not just fossils. They are the first record of an idea that would echo through every age that followed. The idea that some lives could be erased not by accident, but by design. When the archaeologists finished digging through the grave, they turned their attention to what was left of the village around it. What they found was haunting. The site looked as if life had stopped mid-sentence. Tools were scattered across the ground. Half-finished pottery sat near cold fire pits, and grains of wheat were still stored inside clay jars, as if waiting for someone to come back and use them. But no one ever did. The houses had collapsed over time, not rebuilt or repaired. The soil above them was untouched for thousands of years. It was as if the place had been erased from the map the moment the killing stopped. Normally, when ancient villages are abandoned, you can see signs of return. People rebuild, new structures rise over the old, life continues. But here, nothing came after. The silence of the site was its loudest clue. Whoever had survived the attack did not return to reclaim it. Maybe they were taken, maybe they fled, or maybe they simply could not bear to come back. The land itself seemed cursed, a wound no one wanted to reopen. In the ruins, archaeologists found meals that had never been eaten, bread left to harden into stone. Animal bones showed that herds were left to wander off. Even small ornaments, things people normally carry with them in times of danger, were still there. Necklaces of shells. A child's toy carved from bone. It was as if the attackers had wanted not just to kill the people, but to erase every trace that they had ever existed. The site offered no signs of looting. The attackers did not take the tools or food. That detail puzzled the scientists. Why destroy a settlement and leave its riches untouched? The answer might lie in the psychology of annihilation. The goal wasn't to gain from this place. The goal was to make it disappear. That is what separates war from extermination. War takes, genocide deletes. The silence that followed this event lasted millennia. Layers of wind-blown soil slowly covered the ruins until only a gentle rise in the landscape marked where the village had once stood. When farmers ploughed these fields thousands of years later, they had no idea what slept beneath their feet. They planted their crops in the same earth that had once been stained by blood. The quiet that hangs over the site today feels heavy, like the land itself remembers. Standing there, you can almost sense the ghosts of unfinished lives. It isn't the violence that haunts the most. It's the emptiness that came after, a stillness that no one dared to disturb. The silence of survivors who never returned is the final evidence that the destruction of this village wasn't random. It was meant to end everything, not just the people, but the memory of them. And for thousands of years, it worked. To understand why a peaceful village became the scene of a massacre, scientists had to look beyond the pit. The answer, they realized, might not lie in weapons or hatred alone, but in the sky, the soil, and the changing world of 7,000 years ago. The Neolithic was supposed to be the beginning of stability. People had learned to plant seeds, raise animals, and stay in one place instead of wandering in search of food. But that new way of life came with new problems. Farming tied people to the land, and land meant power. Every patch of fertile soil was precious, and when the climate began to shift, that power became fragile. Around this time, Europe's weather was changing. Patterns of rainfall were no longer reliable. Seasons grew unpredictable. Fields that once produced plenty of grain began to dry out or flood. Crops failed, herds weakened, and hunger crept into villages that had once been comfortable. In a world without writing or trade networks, there was no way to explain why the sky betrayed them. Fear took root in the cracks left by drought. And when people are afraid, they start looking for someone to blame. Archaeologists think the region around the massacre site was full of competing settlements. Each was small, but their fields and hunting grounds overlapped. When one community's harvest failed, it would have been easy to suspect that the neighbors had better soil or more rain. Maybe they believed those neighbors had stolen luck or favor from the gods. The first spark of resentment probably didn't look like hatred. It looked like suspicion, like whispered stories told around fires. Then came confrontation, small raids, stolen food, injured pride. In a time when survival meant everything, that kind of fear could escalate fast. Eventually, one side decided not to compete anymore, but to eliminate the competition entirely. The massacre was not random fury. It was the end point of a long chain reaction fueled by scarcity and anxiety. Scientists studying pollen from ancient lake beds near the site found signs of deforestation and soil erosion just before the massacre took place. That means people were already overusing the land. Their own success as farmers had pushed the ecosystem to its limit. It was a trap of their own making. When the environment collapsed, so did trust. The killing pit might have been the moment when human cooperation cracked under the pressure of nature. That's the terrifying part of this story. The first genocide may have started with something as simple as hunger. Not ideology, not religion, just fear of running out. It reminds us that civilization is always balanced on that same edge. When food runs short or land dries up, it doesn't take long for neighbors to become enemies. The spark that turned that Neolithic village into a grave still waits inside us all, quiet until the world changes again. Each skull tells a story. When the bones were first laid out in the lab, they looked like data points, evidence for a scientific paper. But the longer the researchers studied them, the harder it was to see them as just numbers. These were people who had names once, who laughed, worked, and loved, even if those details are lost forever. Their skulls became their voices, whispering fragments of what happened on that final day. One belonged to a child, maybe 5 years old. The bones were still delicate, the skull small enough to fit in an adult's hands. Across the front of it was a shallow fracture, not deep enough to kill instantly. It looked like the child had been struck while trying to shield their face. There were more marks on the tiny arm bones, bruises frozen in bone form. The scientists could picture it, a child caught in chaos, reaching up in fear as the world around them fell apart. Another skull belonged to an older woman. Her teeth were worn from years of grinding grain, her joints showing the marks of hard work. The blow that killed her came from behind. The back of her skull was shattered inward by a single strike, likely from a stone adze. It was the kind of injury that happens when someone is running away or trying not to look. She didn't die in battle. She was hunted down. Then there was the man. His skull was found with a long crack stretching from temple to jaw, and one of his leg bones was broken clean through. The angle of the fracture showed he was struck while moving fast. He had tried to flee and had fallen. The cut along his ribs came next, deep enough to slice through muscle and bone. It was clear he didn't die easily. Each skeleton carried its own variation of these wounds. No two were the same, but all shared one thing. They spoke of fear. They spoke of final moments filled with pain and confusion. Forensic scientists could even trace the direction of the blows, reconstructing how people had moved and fallen. The pit began to feel less like an archaeological site and more like a frozen film still from humanity's oldest recorded nightmare. Standing over those remains, one of the researchers said quietly, that the bones looked like they were still trying to escape, and maybe they were. The evidence shows that death came fast, but not without struggle. Some of the bodies were found tangled together, adults and children intertwined, as if they had clung to each other at the end. When you see it up close, it's impossible to think about prehistory as something distant. These were people not so different from us, facing terror that feels uncomfortably familiar. The skulls are not relics, they are witnesses. They remind us that behind every statistic, every archaeological report, there were once beating hearts. The pit isn't just filled with bones. It's filled with the silence of lives cut short and the echoes of voices that still deserve to be heard. The pit was more than a grave. It was a message written in silence. When archaeologists looked at the arrangement of bodies, they noticed something strange. The dead hadn't been placed carefully. They had been dropped, tossed, stacked. Some were upside down, others were twisted into impossible angles. There was no order, no ritual. It wasn't how people buried their loved ones. It was how they buried their shame. The question haunted everyone who studied the site. Why bury them all together? Why not leave the bodies to decay or burn the village to ash? The most likely answer is speed. After the killing, the attackers might have wanted to erase the evidence before it drew predators or disease. They could have forced captives to dig a wide trench and then thrown the bodies in, layer after layer, until the ground was filled. But there is another, darker theory, that the mass grave wasn't an accident of convenience. It was part of the violence itself, a deliberate act of humiliation meant to strip the victims of dignity even in death. By throwing everyone into one pit, the killers erased the boundaries between family and stranger, elder and child. It turned a community into a pile of remains. In many cultures, burial is the last act of care. Here, it was the final act of cruelty. Some archaeologists suggest a different possibility, that the pit was created not by the killers, but by those who came after. Maybe survivors or neighboring groups returned days later, horrified by what they found. They might have gathered the bodies and buried them to give them peace, even if they were not their own people. But the evidence does not fully support that. There are no signs of careful placement or mourning objects. It feels too rushed, too cold. The soil layers show that it was done quickly, probably within hours or days of the massacre. Whoever filled the pit was not grieving. They were cleaning up. The pit itself became a kind of scar on the landscape. To those who made it, it probably felt final. They believed the earth would swallow their actions forever, but it didn't. Thousands of years later, the soil opened and revealed everything they had tried to hide. That is what makes this discovery so powerful. The killers left a signature without realizing it. In trying to bury the evidence, they created proof. The pit became a time capsule of violence, a frozen confession. Every bone, every broken skull, every layer of earth tells the same story. Someone believed they could end a people and vanish without consequence. Instead, they left behind the oldest crime scene in human history. The act meant to erase memory became the very thing that ensured the world would remember. Not everyone agreed that the pit represented the world's first genocide. As soon as the findings were published, debates began in universities and conferences around the world. Some scholars argued that the evidence could point to something else entirely. Maybe it wasn't extermination, but tragedy. Maybe disease or famine had struck the village, forcing people to bury their dead in haste. Others suggested ritual. Ancient communities sometimes buried people together for spiritual reasons. What if the pit was a ceremonial grave misunderstood by modern eyes? Another group proposed that it was the aftermath of a single battle, a one-sided massacre between rival settlements that got out of hand. Each theory had to be tested carefully Because archaeology, unlike storytelling, deals in fragments. You can't ask the dead what happened. You can only read the marks they left behind. The scientists took every counter-argument seriously. If this had been disease, the bones would show different signs. Epidemics don't leave sharp trauma patterns. They leave quiet clues, like bones of people who died in their homes, in sleep, without injury. But here every skeleton carried evidence of violence. Broken skulls, smashed ribs, crushed limbs. The wounds weren't random either. They were focused on vital areas, like heads and necks. The victims didn't die lying down. They died moving, struggling, trying to protect themselves. That alone ruled out illness. The idea of ritual burial was harder to dismiss at first. Some ancient cultures did bury groups together, but rituals have order. This pit had none. The bodies overlapped chaotically, facing every direction, with no pattern or offerings. Ritual burials often include objects like jewelry or pottery meant to guide souls to the next world. Here, there was nothing, just bones and dirt, no respect, no symbolism. Then came the battle theory. Maybe it was just war, one community overwhelming another. The difference is that battles usually have survivors who collect their dead and honor them. The pit contained everyone, from the very old to infants barely born. There were no signs of defensive wounds from the attacker's side. The evidence pointed to total destruction, and that's what made the genocide interpretation unavoidable. Everything fit too neatly. The demographic gap, the missing young women, the sudden disappearance of the entire settlement, and the systematic trauma. It was not chaos, it was procedure. The scientists eventually agreed that what they had uncovered wasn't just violence, but a plan. The attackers didn't fight to win land or food. They fought to remove a people from existence. The skepticism was healthy. It forced the research to be precise, not emotional. But in the end, the bones kept speaking the same truth. Even when every other explanation was tested, one picture remained clear. This was not the story of nature or accident. It was the story of human intent. And that intent was extermination. When the discovery of the skeleton pit was first made public, it seemed like a grim but isolated tragedy. A single village erased in a moment of prehistoric rage. But as researchers began comparing notes with other teams across Europe, something unsettling began to surface. This wasn't a lone event. It was part of a pattern stretching across the continent, separated by hundreds of miles but united by the same chilling details. In southern Germany, archaeologists had already uncovered a site filled with men, women, and children tossed into a pit, their skulls crushed and limbs broken. In Austria, another burial contained victims whose hands and feet had been bound before death. In the Czech Republic, a cluster of mass graves revealed people killed by blows to the head, just like those in the pit. Each site belonged to the same era, the early Neolithic, and each told the same story of sudden destruction. The similarities were too precise to ignore. Everywhere the same clues appeared. Overkill, execution-style injuries, whole families wiped out, missing women of childbearing age, tools and weapons identical to those of their attackers. It was as if the same nightmare had played out again and again across the first farming settlements of Europe. Scientists began to wonder whether this was coincidence or connection. Could these massacres have been part of a wider collapse, a chain reaction of fear and revenge rippling through early farming societies? As more evidence emerged, the theory gained weight. Around 7,000 years ago, Europe was undergoing huge change. Farming communities were spreading fast, clearing forests and pushing into new lands. Resources became scarce, and competition for fertile soil grew fierce. The archaeological record began to show an increase in burned settlements and mass burials during this period. Violence, once rare, had become woven into the rhythm of Neolithic life. The most haunting part of this pattern is that the killers and the killed were always the same kind of people. No foreign invaders, no different species, just neighbours separated by rivers or valleys. It suggests that genocide wasn't born from difference but from proximity. People turned on those most like themselves. The European Neolithic now reads less like a peaceful dawn of civilization and more like a continent learning how to destroy itself. For centuries, we imagined the first farmers as gentle pioneers building a new world. The bones tell a different story. They show that the invention of farming also created the invention of territory, and that territory brought war. The pit that started as a single mystery became a mirror reflecting a shared human flaw. The capacity for violence wasn't local, it was everywhere. It travelled with us as we spread, growing fields and growing fear. The same instincts that built our first villages also tore them apart. When archaeologists connected the dots between all these sites, they realized the truth was larger than any single grave. The massacre wasn't an exception. It was a beginning. Before farming, humanity had no borders. People moved with the seasons, following herds, gathering wild plants, sharing landscapes without fences or ownership. But when humans began to plant crops and stay in one place, something fundamental changed in the way we saw the world and in the way we saw each other. The Neolithic Revolution wasn't just about food, it was about identity. Once people began to farm, land became more than ground beneath their feet. It became inheritance, power, and survival. Every cleared field, every patch of fertile soil represented labour that could not be shared. Families who spent months tending crops began to see outsiders as threats. For the first time, humanity divided itself into circles of belonging. There was us, the people of this valley, this settlement, this soil, and there was them, the others who lived beyond the ridge. It sounds simple, but it was the start of a psychological revolution that would shape the rest of history. The first fences were not just made of wood, they were built in the mind. Archaeologists studying early Neolithic sites have found signs of this shift everywhere. Villages that had once been open began to build ditches and palisades. Graves began to show differences in status, proof that property and power were becoming linked. The same period that saw the rise of farming also saw the rise of conflict. The skeleton pit fits perfectly into this transformation. The massacre wasn't just a fight over food, it was a fight over belonging. These early farmers were discovering the dangerous magic of identity. When people define themselves by land, they start to believe that outsiders don't just threaten their homes, but their very existence. That fear can turn quickly into hatred. It's easy to imagine how it began. A bad harvest, a boundary dispute, accusations that the next village had taken water or game. The first small fights became raids. The raids became vengeance. Eventually, the logic of us and them hardened into something that felt natural. Protect your own. Destroy the other. What makes this story haunting is that it all happened at the same time humanity was learning cooperation on a massive scale. Farming required teamwork, planning, and trust. Yet the same social skills that built communities also built exclusion. The same communication that allowed cooperation allowed propaganda. We could unite more easily than ever before, but we could also turn that unity against others. The bones in the pit are the outcome of that paradox. They show that identity is both our greatest strength and our greatest weakness. The first farmers invented the idea of home, but in doing so, they also invented the idea of outsider. It was the start of a story that never really ended. The moment we built our first fences, we built our first enemies. For a long time, people believed that genocide was a product of civilization, that mass killing required governments, armies, and leaders to plan it. But the pit proves that isn't true. Long before nations or empires existed, small bands of farmers already had everything they needed to destroy each other completely. They didn't have written orders or generals. They didn't need them. All they needed was fear, belief, and the will to act. The Neolithic villagers who carried out the massacre lived in communities smaller than a modern neighborhood. They had simple tools and no hierarchy we can recognize. Yet their violence was as organized as any military campaign. The evidence shows coordination. People were rounded up, executed, and buried methodically. That doesn't happen in chaos. It takes planning. It takes communication. It takes agreement among a group to commit an atrocity together. These people didn't have nations, but they had loyalty. They had the bond of family, of tribe, of us. That was enough to turn cooperation into destruction. What's most chilling is how familiar it feels. The attackers probably believed they were protecting their own. Maybe they told themselves the other group was dangerous, that killing them was necessary for safety or revenge. That same justification has echoed through every age. Archaeologists now see the pit as proof that total war doesn't need modern tools. It needs only human nature under pressure. Fear can unite people as powerfully as love. Once it spreads, it takes on a life of its own. The same social intelligence that lets us work together to build villages can also organize the wiping out of another one. The bones show precision. The killers didn't fight in a rage. They struck where it mattered most. The skulls crushed from behind. The consistent direction of the wounds all point to discipline. These were not spontaneous acts of hate. They were executions. That realization changes how we see early human society. We like to imagine the Stone Age as simple, innocent, untouched by the darkness that later history would bring. But the truth is that the instincts behind modern war were already there. The tools were crude, but the emotions were not. Fear, loyalty, vengeance. They were enough to turn small disagreements into extermination. The people who dug that pit had no kings, no soldiers, no banners, yet they managed to erase an entire community from existence. That is what makes this discovery so unsettling. It shows that the roots of organized violence run deeper than politics. They run through the human mind itself. Civilization didn't invent total war. It just gave it bigger weapons. The first genocide wasn't commanded from a palace. It began around campfires, whispered between neighbors, until the decision to kill felt like duty. And once the killing began, nothing could stop it. It probably began just before sunrise. The air would have been cool and still, the fields damp with dew. Inside the small mud houses, families were beginning to stir. Someone stoked a fire. Someone else reached for a clay jar of grain. Then, from the edge of the settlement, came the first sound. The low rhythm of running feet, the sudden bark of shouts, the whistle of arrows through the air. Within seconds, the calm morning shattered. Men rushed outside, still half asleep, grabbing tools that were never meant to be weapons, flint blades, digging sticks, anything at hand. The first wave of arrows struck before they could form any defense. Those who tried to fight were cut down quickly. There was no chance for resistance. The attack was fast, practiced, and merciless. The archaeologists could see it in the bones later. Blows to the back of the skull, clean and hard. wounds that suggested people were struck while turning away or trying to flee. The attackers didn't pause. They moved from house to house, methodically, breaking in doors, setting roofs ablaze. Smoke would have filled the air, turning the rising sun into a red haze. The sound of screaming, of animals panicking, of fire consuming dry thatch echoed across the valley. The children were not spared. Tiny skeletons with shattered bones proved that. Some were likely caught in the chaos, others deliberately hunted. The older ones may have tried to hide in the grain stores or behind walls, but there was nowhere safe. Every part of the village became a trap. The attackers seemed to know exactly what they were doing. It was not random slaughter. It was extermination. They killed quickly, avoided injury, and moved in formation. This was a plan, not rage. When it was over, silence returned, but it was not peace. A few young women were taken alive. Their absence from the pit tells that part of the story. They would have been valuable as captives, absorbed into the attackers' own group. Everyone else was gone. Those who survived the initial onslaught were executed later. The pit was dug, not deep, just enough to hide what was left. Bodies were thrown in without care, stacked in layers. Some still bore traces of burned skin, others were tied. Within a few hours, the village that had existed for generations was gone. No rebuilding, no mourning, no return. Archaeologists call it a reconstruction, but what they really built was a time machine. Every fractured bone, every arrowhead, every burn mark tells a piece of that morning. When the data is put together, it forms a picture so precise it feels like watching the event unfold. No gore, no drama, just cold, methodical violence. The attackers didn't destroy the village because they had to. They destroyed it because they decided to. And when the last body fell, and the pit was covered with earth, they walked away believing they had erased their enemies forever. They were wrong. The earth remembered everything. When scientists began examining the smallest skeletons from the pit, the mood in the lab shifted. Adults could be explained as casualties of war or revenge, but the children changed everything. Their bones were fragile, barely the size of a researcher's hand. Some were toddlers, others no older than 10. They were found close together, their tiny frames mixed with those of their parents. The evidence was undeniable. This was not a battlefield. This was the killing of a future that never had the chance to grow. The smallest child in the pit was less than 2 years old. Its skull showed a single, sharp impact to the side of the head. The blow was quick and final. Another skeleton, slightly older, had both forearm bones fractured, the kind of injury seen when someone raises their arms to block a strike. The scientists called these defensive wounds. Even children had tried to protect themselves. There were no signs that they had been buried with care. They were dumped with everyone else, thrown into the same pit as if their lives carried no difference. That detail struck the team hardest. Ancient societies often protected their young, even in times of conflict. The fact that the attackers had not only killed the children but buried them in such a way meant something more than hatred. It meant intent. It meant erasure. Killing children achieves nothing in war except to remove the next generation. It was the same logic that modern societies now recognize as genocide, the destruction of a lineage, not just a community. Some of the young victims still had milk teeth in their jaws. Their bones showed signs of good health before death. They were well fed, well cared for, children of a thriving settlement. That made their deaths even more tragic because it meant the village had been doing well before the attack. They weren't starving or sick. They were simply in the wrong place when fear came calling. Scientists found traces of small items buried near some of them. Not placed there intentionally, but likely things they had carried at the time. A bead, a shell, a fragment of toy. These tiny artifacts turned data into heartbreak. They were reminders that these were not faceless victims. They were people who laughed, played, and followed parents through fields. Their stories ended in the same pit that swallowed the adults. The presence of children proves beyond argument that this was not honorable combat. It was extermination by design. No warrior code justifies that. No survival need explains it. The killing of the youngest is the clearest sign of what this massacre truly was, an attempt to wipe out not just the living but the possibility of tomorrow. The children in the pit are silent now, but their bones speak louder than any words. They remind us that every act of destruction is also an act against the future, and in that silence lies the true weight of what humanity lost that day. When scientists finally extracted DNA from the bones in the pit, they were hoping for a miracle. Maybe some trace of this lost community survived in us. Maybe their story didn't end completely in that hole in the ground. But as the results came in, the hope faded. The genetic data showed no clear descendants, no continuity linking these people to later populations in the same region. It was as if an entire branch of the human family tree had been snapped off and burned. What made the finding even more haunting was how final it looked in the archaeological record. After the massacre, the style of pottery in the area changed. The way houses were built changed. The tools, the ornaments, even the patterns carved into clay all shifted within a generation. Everything that made this community distinct vanished from the landscape. It was not just their bodies that disappeared, their culture did too. Anthropologists call these lost groups ghost populations. People who once lived, worked, and loved, but left no trace in the DNA of anyone alive today. Their bloodlines ended so completely that only bones and tools remained to tell their story. When researchers compared the genetic sequences from the victims to other early farmers in Europe, they found similarities but no direct link. These people belonged to one branch of the first agricultural migrants to spread across the continent, but their descendants, if any survived, were absorbed into other groups or replaced entirely. The massacre might have been one of the reasons why. In cultural terms, their story ended in that pit. The attackers not only killed them, but took their land, their tools, their ideas, and reshaped them into something new. What followed was silence, then replacement. Within a few generations, another settlement stood nearby, different in design and material, showing no sign of the old identity. This is what genocide looks like in deep time. Not just the death of individuals, but the vanishing of a culture so complete that even its language, its songs, and its memories dissolve into the soil. The people in the pit are part of our shared human story, yet they are also completely gone. The DNA results remind us that survival is not guaranteed. We are used to thinking of human history as a continuous thread, one generation passing life to the next. But every so often, that thread breaks, and everything connected to it disappears forever. The victims in this pit were one of those breaks. Their genes didn't make it into modern humanity in any measurable way, but their story did. Through science, we can finally hear echoes of their lives and deaths. The fact that their DNA faded from the earth doesn't mean they are forgotten. It means they exist as a reminder that even in prehistory, entire worlds could end in a single day, leaving behind nothing but silence and the bones of a people who once were. No one knows the names of the killers, but science can still ask what they feared. Fear always leaves fingerprints, even in prehistory. It hides in patterns, in choices, in the strange precision of cruelty. The people who attacked this village didn't kill for sport. They killed with purpose, and that purpose came from fear. Maybe it was fear of hunger. Climate records from the time show unpredictable rains, failed crops, and shrinking fertile land. When food becomes scarce, every field becomes a battlefield. To protect their survival, the attackers may have convinced themselves that the only way to live was to eliminate those who shared their valley. In their minds, it wasn't murder, it was preemptive defense. That is how fear disguises itself as logic. Or maybe it was fear of betrayal. Farming communities were bound by fragile alliances. If one group broke away, taking skills, seeds, or livestock, it could weaken everyone else. The victims might have been defectors or rivals who refused to follow shared rules. To the attackers, that defiance could have looked like a threat to order itself. Killing them may have felt like restoring balance. Another possibility is fear wrapped in belief. The Neolithic world was spiritual, full of rituals tied to seasons, harvests, and survival. If drought struck or disease spread, people often looked for reasons in the supernatural. A failed harvest could mean that someone had angered the spirits or broken a taboo. Maybe the murdered village was accused of bringing misfortune. If the attackers believed that destroying them would cleanse the land, then the massacre could have been an act of faith as much as vengeance. That is what makes human violence so terrifying. Ordinary motives can become extraordinary cruelty when fear and belief mix. The psychological leap from threat to extermination is smaller than we want to admit. The killers didn't need to be monsters. They only needed to believe that their victims were something less than human. Once that idea took hold, the rest followed naturally. Anthropologists studying similar events have found that mass violence often grows out of ordinary human instincts. Protect your own, secure resources, follow your leaders, defend your beliefs. The same instincts that once helped small groups survive can turn deadly when amplified by fear. The pit shows that this transformation was already happening thousands of years before recorded history. The killers feared loss more than guilt. They feared hunger, disloyalty, and cosmic punishment more than the memory of what they did. In their minds, the destruction of a village was a necessary act. And that is what makes the story of this pit so haunting. It reminds us that the roots of cruelty are not found in monsters but in ordinary people terrified of the future. When fear becomes collective, it can turn any group into executioners. The pit was not born from hatred alone. It was born from fear strong enough to silence compassion. When archaeologists brushed away the last layers of soil from the pit, they weren't just uncovering bones, they were uncovering us. Every discovery forced a question no one wanted to ask out loud. If the world's oldest genocide lies at the roots of settled life, what does that say about being human? The Neolithic Revolution was supposed to be our beginning, the moment we learned to grow food, build homes, and live together. But lying beneath that story of progress was another one, written in fractures and skulls. It told us that the same hands that planted seeds were capable of unimaginable violence. And yet, that contradiction might be the key to understanding our nature. The people who built those first villages also built art. They shaped pottery with care, carved patterns into bone, and painted symbols that still speak across time. The same minds that invented farming also invented music and storytelling. They raised children, healed wounds, and buried their dead with love. Humanity was never one thing or the other. We have always been both. The pit doesn't only reveal cruelty. It reveals the thin line between creation and destruction that defines our species. The farmers who built that village had mastered cooperation. They had to. Farming required teamwork, trust, and planning. They built communities stronger than anything their hunter-gatherer ancestors had known. And yet, that same cooperation made genocide possible. The killers had to work together too. They had to plan, coordinate, and act as one. The same skill that built society also enabled its collapse. That realization is difficult to face because it means the potential for kindness and cruelty are not opposites. They are reflections of the same human capacity for connection. When people bond deeply, they can create beauty. But when that bond is turned inward and closed off to others, it can destroy. The pit is not just a grave from prehistory. It is a mirror that shows both faces of our humanity. Archaeologists studying the site often describe the emotional whiplash of their work. One moment they are holding a fragment of pottery so delicate it could only have been made by steady, patient hands. The next moment they are documenting a skull shattered by violence. Creation and destruction layered together in the same soil. It forces a kind of humility. We like to think of ourselves as evolved beyond this, but the truth is that the instincts that made the pit possible are still with us. They live alongside our compassion, our creativity, and our empathy. The story of the pit isn't just about the past. It's a reminder that progress has always walked beside violence, and that our brilliance and brutality grew from the same roots. When we excavate the earth, we are really excavating ourselves. What we find there is not just bones, but the blueprint of what it means to be human, capable of tenderness and terror in the same breath. Calling what happened in that pit a genocide makes some people uneasy. The word feels too heavy, too modern, too full of meaning that didn't exist 7,000 years ago. These people had no governments, no armies, no manifestos declaring who should live and who should die. They had no written language to describe ideology or justify killing. And yet the bones tell a story that sounds painfully familiar. Entire families erased, children slaughtered, survivors taken as captives, and a culture wiped from the map. If that isn't genocide, what is it? The debate isn't about facts, but about ethics. Should we use modern words to describe ancient acts? Does calling it genocide bring justice to the dead or distort the past to fit our own definitions? Archaeologists argue about it quietly, often with more emotion than they expect. Some say it's wrong to apply a term born from the 20th century to people who lived before history. It risks making them into villains from our world instead of their own. It risks pretending that morality existed back then in the same shape it does now. But others say refusing to use the word is its own kind of erasure. If we recognize the pattern, if we see the deliberate attempt to exterminate a group, then not naming it is like closing our eyes. The act of naming becomes a kind of justice, even across millennia. The truth may lie somewhere between those two ideas. Words like genocide carry weight because they reflect not just what happened, but what it meant. When we use that word for the Neolithic massacre, we aren't putting modern guilt on ancient people. We're acknowledging that the logic behind genocide is timeless. It doesn't need governments or speeches. It only needs fear, power, and the belief that some people don't deserve to exist. That belief existed long before we invented words to describe it. Maybe the real reason the word feels uncomfortable is because it brings the past too close. When we call it genocide, we admit that the same mind capable of planting the first field was also capable of destroying a neighbor's world. We admit that the instincts that drove that ancient slaughter are still part of us. It's not an accusation aimed at the dead. It's a mirror held up to the living. Every time we use the word, we remind ourselves that civilization hasn't erased that darkness. It has only learned to hide it better. Looking back at that pit forces us to face the truth that morality is fragile and progress doesn't protect us from ourselves. Using the word genocide isn't about rewriting history. It's about refusing to look away from it. It's about seeing the full scope of what humans have always been, builders and destroyers, capable of both creation and complete annihilation even before we had the words to confess it. It's tempting to look at the pit and divide the story neatly into monsters and victims, to see the killers as something other than human, something ancient and cruel that we've long since evolved beyond. But that would be a lie. The truth is harder. There is no them. There is only earlier us. The people who carried out the massacre had the same kind of brains we do, the same emotions, the same fears, the same capacity for love and loyalty that we celebrate today. They built homes, raised children, told stories, and cared for each other. Then one day, they turned that same devotion inward and used it as a weapon. They killed not because they were broken, but because they were human. That's what makes the pit so haunting. It doesn't show a species we left behind. It shows us before mirrors and history books, before we learned to name our violence. When we look at those bones, we're looking at a version of ourselves stripped of excuses. Archaeologists say the killers and the killed lived just a few valleys apart. Their tools were identical, their pottery shared the same designs. If you put them side by side, you couldn't tell them apart. The difference existed only in their minds, an invisible line drawn between who belonged and who didn't. That line still runs through the modern world. It has changed names and languages, but it hasn't disappeared. The pit is proof that our capacity to divide, to protect, to destroy was already wired into us when we first settled down to plant crops. It's the same instinct that fuels every conflict, every prejudice, every border that has followed. Some of the archaeologists who worked at the site said they felt like they were digging through time, lapse footage of human behavior, a loop repeating itself again and again. Fear turns into suspicion. Suspicion turns into hate. Hate becomes policy or war or massacre. Then, centuries later, we find the bones and tell ourselves we're different. But we're not. Our brains still light up the same way under threat. We still build groups and defend them. We still draw lines between us and them. The only difference now is that our tools are sharper and our reach is global. The pit isn't just a record of the past. It's a warning written in bone. It shows that what happened there doesn't belong to a lost world. It belongs to a pattern we still live inside. When we stare into that pit, we're not looking at strangers from a vanished age. We're looking at our reflection, caught in slow motion, frozen mid-act, proving that the oldest story we've ever told is the one where we learn nothing and do it again. The pit is empty now. The bones have been cleaned, measured, and labelled, resting in quiet drawers inside a museum. The soil that once covered them has been sifted and studied. The place where the massacre happened looks ordinary again, a patch of grass under a wide sky. If you walked there today, you would never guess what the ground once held. But the dead still speak, not through voices, but through data. Every fracture, every cut, every strand of DNA has become part of a new kind of story, one told by science instead of memory. It is the story of how early we learned to destroy and how early we learned that we didn't have to. The warning in the bones isn't only about what happened 7,000 years ago, it's about what we still carry inside us. The people who killed and the people who died were not separated by culture or technology. They were separated by a choice, the same choice that appears every time fear and belonging collide, to protect or to destroy, to include or to erase. The pit proves that choice existed even then. They had the ability to cooperate, to share land, to find peace, but they didn't. They chose fear, and that single decision erased an entire world. When archaeologists pack away the remains, they don't close the story, they preserve it for the future, for us to read again when we forget what we're capable of. The bones become a warning label written in prehistory. They tell us that civilization doesn't begin when we invent farming or writing. It begins when we decide not to repeat this. Standing at the site after the excavation ended, one researcher said it felt like leaving behind a courtroom after the verdict. The evidence had been heard. Humanity had been found guilty of itself. But there was also something else, a trace of hope buried within the horror. Because if those early farmers could choose fear, they could have chosen differently too. The existence of choice means we are not doomed to repeat the same mistakes forever. The first genocide doesn't just show how early we learned to destroy. It shows how early we were capable of choosing not to. The bones remind us that cruelty is not destiny. It's a decision we keep making. The grass grows again over the site. The wind erases the footprints. But beneath it all, the memory remains, urging us to listen. We have their same hands, their same minds, their same fragile gift of choice. The warning in the bones is simple. What happened once can happen again. What was chosen once can be chosen differently. The story buried for 7,000 years ends with us deciding whether we will keep digging graves or finally learn to stop.